Hey guys, so this video was supposed to be posted in Halloween, but because of school and the tedious time it takes to make a single video in this format, the fact that I'm reviewing a scary story in early 2019 is kind of arbitrary. Nonetheless, I already have a script written and some drawings drawn for this racist bastard story by the time the deadline had passed, and I'm not going to waste all of my hard work on nothing. So roll the review, and I do hope that I do not offend someone because Howard over here really likes to say the word neg. If you have read through some of my book reviews, which I'm guessing that you haven't, then you probably know who H.P. Lovecraft is. He made music for Eric Zahn, Cool Air, The Tomb, Color Out of Space, Pickman's Model, and the one that you might be familiar with, Call of Cthulhu. I may have mentioned before how his stories is a mix between horror and science fiction, but I later learned that his works are far more than what I have described them as. Lovecraftian horror, or in other terms, cosmic horror, is a genre that he started that dealt less with the shock factor and focused more on the greatest fear that mankind has ever faced, the unknown. If you compare some of the stories created at that time, you can kind of understand why he was an icon of his time. We have works that explores numerous levels of existentialism, bringing out the idea that the reason that we exist is to prolong a behemoth that brings utter chaos when left unworshipped. That the greatest fear of mankind is when we come face to face with creatures from the outer realms of our solar system, in which our limited minds would only become insane by just the sight of their unbearable appearance. That deep beneath the caverns of the earth lies forbidden knowledge, which I, myself, am afraid to even mention. That the only way to escape the unstoppable force is to die a painful death, and you will be lucky if you end up in one of the 9 circles of hell. As for me, I think his works are more of a hit or miss. They have a tendency of giving too much unnecessary exposition at the start. I might also complain about the number of times the first-person narrator had to say lines that go something like, "Oh, I can't fathom this indescribable object," but sometimes it just adds to the fear of the unknown aspect of the story, and sometimes it doesn't. The Whisperer in Darkness, meanwhile, is just a story that left me disappointed. It is a 26,000-word novella that he has published in 1931 through a pulp magazine known as Weird Tales. It isn't exactly a popular work of his when I was researching the subject for this video, and the only time that someone has made a reference to the story, as far as I can tell, was in Robert E. Howard's The Black Stone. But even then, I can't be sure if it was pure coincidence that reminds me of W.D. or not. As of how I found the work, was through an anthology assembled by S.T. Joshi entitled Lovecraft Short Stories, a collection that claims that all of the text remained unaltered. With my opinion against the quality of the story, is there any redeeming factors that I could gather? Well, let's get the summary out of the way, then let's talk about it. The story starts off with Albert Wilmarth giving his insight on the people's opinion on the Vermont floods. You see, newspapers have reported of something weird floating around the Winooski River, the West River, and the Passumpik. It was the corpses of a strange creature that none of the observers have been able to identify. And since I am a bad drawer, here's my artist's interpretation of what these creatures might be. Albert Wilmarth is an instructor of literature in Miskatonic University, so he has the right to disprove the theories from people who believes that this signifies some event such as the rise of the Antichrist. We see him receive letters from these people and giving his 2 cents on the matter, when on chapter 2, the story introduces Henry Akeley. Henry Akeley is a person from Vermont, and in comparison to the people who disprove Henry's reasonable claims, Henry is actually the most stable-minded out of all of them. So what does he have to say to Wilmarth to back up his claims? Let's read his letter to him, shall we? My dear sir, I have read through your article on why this whole event is not a sign that the Mayans have decided to move the apocalypse at an earlier date. But you see, they are somewhat right. It is not an apocalypse. It is aliens. The things come from another planet, and they can fly through space and can easily conquer the Earth if they just give us shit. I knew too much, and there's a crazy guy named Brown stalking my every move. He must be one of them. Anyway, I am sending you a black rock, a picture of a random footprint, and a phonograph in order to prove my point. Tally-ho, Henry W. Akeley. After inspecting the evidence that Henry sent, Wilmarth believed that he must be onto something, and from there, they joined forces in investigating the alien species that have decided to inhabit the dark valleys of North America. So on they study, until one day, Wilmarth decided that he should inspect the black stone which was still in Akeley's hands. You see, Wilmarth lives in Arkham while Akeley lives in Vermont. They haven't met each other yet in person, so every time they want to inspect a certain piece of evidence, they need to go to the tedious process of snail mail. At this point, they knew that there were numerous attempts of these items getting stolen, so they had to constantly change the route on which the commodities are being delivered through. But it was only afterwards when the black stone disappeared from the train on which it sat. Albert and Akeley seems to care for it, but I'm not invested in summarizing this part of the story. Let's move on. Chapter 4 is when the events got intense. Akeley mailed Albert a letter saying that the things are getting closer. He thought that his dogs would make them flee, but the aliens somehow learned to use guns now. Up until the end of Chapter 4, I thought that things are going just as I have expected, and that Wilmarth will be their next target. The results? Well, it did happen that way, but with a clever twist. To explain this twist, we first have to address the fact that Akeley is still alive. And that's alive with a bunch of distinguishable air quotes because you can clearly tell where this is going. Wilmarth received a letter from Akeley saying that he's alive and that there are no bad aliens. There are good aliens. All they want is peace, non-molestation, and knowledge on the earth and its inhabitants, such as mankind. Also, can you come over and bring me the phonograph, photos, and any other evidence which might give these aliens a bad reputation? Thank you, Henry Akeley. Now, of course, my boy, Wilmarth over here, an instructor of literature at Miskatonic University in Arkham, Massachusetts, and a person of reason when unexplainable events happen, can easily recognize that this is a trap. Where did he go? As I was saying, my boy, Wilmarth over here, an instructor of literature at Miskatonic University in Arkham, Massachusetts, and a person of reason when unexplainable events happen, decides to go to Vermont and visit the not-dead Henry Akeley. Shortly after arriving at the station, he was greeted by Noyce, a driver by which Akeley has assigned to pick up Wilmarth, or so he says. He took him to Akeley's place, which was in the middle of the woods of all things. Akeley's house was seen from the photos that Wilmarth received, which is why he is not so surprised about the location of his home, and just left him there after talking a bit with Akeley inside. When comfortable with the atmosphere of the entire place, he finally realizes that this is a big mistake. Hoping that the house is a safe haven, he goes inside and meets Akeley at the library. He was sick from asthma, so he had to cover himself with a blanket for the rest of the story. He told Wilmarth about how friendly of a race that these aliens were, and the knowledge that he was given because of said friendship. He also said that they bring humans into their worlds as well, but because our bodies are very fragile to the vacuum outside of Earth, they had to extract the brain from our heads and put them in a warm cylinder where they are safe and sound and probably dead. Oh, but that's just a theory. Okay, Fury. He then introduces Wilmarth to a brain in a jar, and after setting up a few machinery, the brain started talking. Where in the devil is this story going? The brain talked to Albert about how he is a human being like him, and that he was one of the guys that had their brains removed by those aliens that are definitely good creatures. It also tells us that it has been in many celestial bodies, both inside and outside our solar system, and he hopes that Wilmarth will also explore the vast cosmos via the whole brain extraction. Wilmarth slept that night with a burning passion to leave the place as abandoned by the gods, and decides to escape that place just when he heard a conversation downstairs in which he suspects to be the voices of the aliens that Akeley mentioned and the voice of Noyce. He thinks that Akeley is in trouble, but you see, my boy, Wilmarth over here, an instructor of literature at Miskatonic University in Arkham, Massachusetts, and a person of reason when unexplainable events happen, would finally have gotten to the conclusion that Akeley is actually dead. Where did he go? Albert, I swear to God if you're in here. Oh no. Wait, Why did... Oh jeez! Wilmar finally decided to make a run for it. As soon as he arrived at the confines of civilization, he called in a sheriff's posse to inspect the place for what he saw in that forest, in that home, in that room, with the head and hands of Henry Akeley. What I do not like is that, despite being a story that's supposed to be vague in its descriptions, it can get pretty predictable. At chapter 4, you can clearly tell that Akeley is a goner, and chapter 5 was trying to comfort the reader by saying, you know, maybe it's not dead, but hey, I'm not that dumb. While there are some things that came out as a surprise, which I will get into in a moment, you're not supposed to be right about your predictions when reading a story that's mainly plot-driven. Wilmarth is also a character. He does things that paints himself as different in comparison to the person that he was in chapter 1. Akeley might have convinced him into the whole aliens bit, but he is certainly not stupid, and I wouldn't have minded if he was a supporting character. But this is the main character and first-person narrator that we are talking about. When you get to see firsthand his thought process in picking his decisions, you can't help but look down at how this man has fallen. The Blackstone also comes off as somewhat of a time waster. They never introduce it again, and doesn't exactly affect the conclusion. There must be a shocking moment that I might have missed, but because the story only invested a page in describing what this item is, I can only guess that it comes off as unnecessary. Now you might be saying, "Oh Vanilla, you pessimistic douchebag, you're only hating on this piece because it makes you look edgy in front of your audience." Oh, but look at this. You see this? It's a good point written in this review. I ain't going to complain for 11 minutes. This is a 5-star criticism on a yarn written in the early 20th century, and the person who wrote the story died, so who would actually take into account my thoughts? Ignore that last part. Anyway, I know that my summary paints the story in a bad and goofy light, but in all honesty, the story is more macabre than you might expect. I mean, sure, the idea of space aliens abducting humans via extracting their brain is a very silly concept in paper, but if you look at how the story describes these creatures as the story progresses, you're kind of sold as to how gruesome these outer beings were. In chapter 1, we get to see the dead carcasses of this alien race. From here, the story establishes the idea that there are a number of them living in the dark areas of the globe and that they are hostile to the human race if they were to cross their boundaries, as stated by the information given by Wilmar's opposers. This gives the audience a general idea of how their presence impacts humanity as a whole. From chapter 2 all the way to chapter 4, you were given the view of a man who was being hunted down by these terrible things without having a first-person perspective on how Henry was killed. I find this a very clever way of adding into the fear of the unknown aspect of the story, because we don't get a direct view of what is happening to him, but because the readers were already given the idea that these monsters mean dangerous business, we were led to imagine on our own what Akeley must be experiencing. We have our own opinion on the worst ways someone could die, and I think that keeping it vague to the reader is an interesting way to amp up the horror. Last few chapters is kind of where all the hope that I had for the story to be good was lost. It gave us more insight as to what these aliens are doing in our planet, yet there are still things left for the reader to ponder on. I find this both as a positive and a negative comment to some of you. Positive, because if you're going to keep us scared, keep everything vague. However, if you have some loose plot threads at this point in the story, you're going to give the reader an unsatisfying ending. After reading Whisperer in Darkness, it felt like everything was just exposition that you would need to follow in order to understand some sequel. However, I'm not here to see a teaser to a future story. I want a plot with a twinning climax and some form of resolution. I'm not saying that the world should be saved by the end of the story or something, but maybe resolve some conflict that only exists between Akeley and Wilmarth or something of that sort. However, no problem was fixed, little info has been clarified, and the only thing that changed was that Wilmarth became a believer of these creatures. This is the same complaint that I can also give to some of Howard's other works. Lovecraft is setting up this pseudo-mythology of creatures and monsters that crosses dimensions and are basically gods amongst humans. But here's the thing. Great fiction can be myths, but myths can't be great fiction. I'm still burning through S.T. Jossi's anthology of Lovecraft's works, in hopes that I might be invested in this interconnected timeline of horror and mystery, and it turns out I did. Not for the plot though, but because the lore around his works are just out of this world. I mean, geez, this guy knows how to creatively scare his readers. My favorite of his was Caller Out of Space. Still suffers from some of the problems mentioned in this review, but I kind of got invested with this character named Nahum Gardner, and the transformation of his form was interesting to read. In terms of the Whisperer in Darkness, it is not the worst out of all of them, but it is best to skip this over. I'm already in Dreams of the Witch's House, and no reference to the story can be found in any of the following stories, which I guess is for the best. Why make obscure mentions to the story when no one's willing to read it? It truly failed because of the ambiguity of certain details and Albert Wilmorf. I'm giving it a 5,328 out of 8.
Level 1. Rhythm.